Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our first Protect Your Story webinar, which will spotlight food entrepreneurs in the Los Angeles community. My name is Chinwe Ohanale Agu, pronouns she, her, and I serve as a senior program manager for the Michelson Intellectual Property Institute, which is an initiative of the Michelson 20mm Foundation. Now, historically, intellectual property was a topic discussed behind closed doors, often within small insular communities that didn't necessarily reflect the larger community. The field is riddled with jargon and legalese that makes it difficult for everyday people to understand how intellectual property is all around them and the role that it plays. For example, have you considered how when you turn on the TV to watch the new Dune Prophecy series on HBO, plug in your Spotify into your car to jam out to the newest Kendrick Lamar album, or buy a really unique bomber jacket from a local stand at the flea market, you're actually interacting with intellectual property. While we're hoping that this series helps bring all of that to light for you. Now, Protect Your Story, storytelling through food in particular, will explore how food, culture, and intellectual property intersect and interact. In this session, we'll examine these relationships with the help of local food entrepreneurs and a legal expert. By the end, we hope that you leave feeling informed and empowered to take charge of your own creations. Here at Michelson IP, we strive to diversify the innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem by ensuring that more people are aware of the value of their creations. Now, we do that by being committed to democratizing IP education, ensuring that all people from all backgrounds are able to identify their IP, register it, and build generational wealth for themselves and their communities. To do so, we must make sure more people from all ages and walks of life are exposed to intellectual property education. This requires that we meet people where they are as they're creating, which ensures that your stories are told and your creations remain your own. So as you listen to the incredible stories from our panelists, please feel free to share your comments and questions. So questions are welcome in the Q&A feature. You'll be able to see in your, I think in the bottom of the Zoom window. And that will help us make sure that those questions are seen and answered. For comments throughout the discussion, we invite you to join the discussion. We invite you to join the discussion in using the chat. And some of you have already started doing that, so that's awesome. We also look to expand our webinar offerings. This is one of maybe two that we've offered this year, and we're hoping that we can get some feedback from you. And to do that, we are going to be sharing some polls throughout the event to capture the things you like and identify areas that might need some adjustments. So, in fact, here comes the first poll, surprise. So we're going to use this poll to gauge who's in the audience, who's in the room, and also how familiar you are with intellectual property before we dive into today's discussion. Now, while you're answering that quick poll for us, we'll jump into the meat of this discussion. We recognize that a fundamental form of connection and a shared identity begins at the local level. Although we live in a global world in which we have the ability to instantly connect with anyone, our ability to relate on a global scale often begins by first relating on a smaller scale. That is why we are welcoming entrepreneurs from our local community in Los Angeles to share their stories as well as the vibrant businesses and ecosystems that they are a part of. First, we have Carla Tatiana Vasquez, who is a food writer, recipe developer, and food stylist based here in Los Angeles. Her writing has been published by the Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and Teen Vogue, among others. Carla's recipe development work can be seen in Food and Wine, Serious Eats, BuzzFeed Tasty, and Tastemade. She is also a food justice advocate and an active member in her community to increase healthy food accessibility in low-income communities. previously working with Hunger Action Los Angeles and Los Angeles Food Policy Council. To preserve her family's recipes, Carla founded Salvi Soul. Since then, it's expanded to focus on cultural memory and intergenerational healing for the Salvadorian diaspora. Secondly, we have In a Pickle's founder, Janet Song. In a Pickle was born from a vision that pickles can be enjoyed daily with a variety of meals, not just sandwiches. Janet's Korean culture and childhood experience paved the way for her deep love and appreciation for fermented foods and pickled veggies. After witnessing her parents eat kimchi with every meal, Janet saw how pickles have a place at the table throughout the day. During the pandemic, Janet pivoted from teaching yoga full time to starting a gourmet pickle business. She is now offering a variety of pickles, fermented kimchi products, Bloody Mary mixes, and spicy relishes at 6 different farmers markets throughout Los Angeles and San Bernardino County. Janet is driven by the goal of creating a fun and educational experience for her customers. To take that dream to the next level, she recently launched a hands-on kids pickle workshop. Looking ahead, Janet plans to continue expanding the business to other markets and retail partners. She'll also host a pickle workshop throughout Los Angeles. Finally, we have Jonathan A. Hyman. Jonathan is a partner at Kenobi Martin's Los Angeles office. He is the co-chair of the firm's advertising, media, and entertainment practice group, which includes helping companies navigate false advertising claims for foods and beverages, and is also the co-chair of the firm's CBD and legal cannabis group. Jonathan's practice includes domestic and foreign trademark review, prosecution, and enforcement, licensing, copyrights, and rights of publicity. Jonathan represents clients in a number of industries, but especially enjoys working with food and beverage companies. He's helped numerous food and beverage clients raise funding based on their IP and have successful exits, including the acquisition of BAI Brands by Dr. Pepper Snapple Group for $1.7 billion, and the acquisition of One Brands by Hershey for $397 million. Jonathan is a founding board member of the California IP Alliance, whose mission is to increase IP awareness and education, advance DEI issues in the IP ecosystem, and foster IP ecosystem collaboration. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, Carla, Janet, and Jonathan. There we go. Awesome. So I like to start with origin stories because I think that's a fun place to start. And it's a great way for everyone to get to know you all. So I'm going to ask a variation of the same question because I know we have entrepreneurs and an attorney. So what would you say is the origin story for you as a business owner or as a legal professional? And can you share a memorable story from your journey of building your brand, especially for the food entrepreneurs that you feel connects deeply to your heritage? And then for Jonathan, something that maybe was an experience maybe that was pivotal in your professional journey that kind of made you go in the direction that you did. So I'll start off with Janet. Let's start off with you.
Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone. Really happy to be here. So I started off my pickle business. Actually, it was a long time dream of mine. And it really stems from my culture because, I grew up Korean and I was around fermented foods and pickled veggies my whole life. So from my culture, I grew this love for and appreciation for these types of foods. And the inspiration behind wanting to start my pickle business was to just share the joy that I experienced myself from eating these foods and just all the health benefits that come with it as well. And then a story I could share about my culture. I think that there's been a huge shift from like experiencing a lot of shame growing up in my culture. My mom would pack lunches with kimchi, and people would think that it smelled funny, or you know, they were unfamiliar with these types of food. So I grew up really embarrassed to be eating my culture's food.
Mhm.
But now, you know, I feel like there's a lot more inclusivity with a variety of cultures, and it's shifted from a lot of shame to being really proud to share my culture's food.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I can relate to that. I had my own little fat flask with culture food coming to school. So great story. Carla, what about you?
Hi everyone. So I think as far as origin stories, I think there's so many moments in our lives that we have to start kind of the thing that makes us tick. And I think that I met those moments a lot. One moment that really sticks out to me is I had just started this journey of asking questions about Salvadoran cuisine and Salvadoran food history. And I think, I've said this a few times in conversations how I think of myself as more as a library kid. Yes, I'm an immigrant. Yes, I'm a woman, but I loved the library as a kid. And before there were labels put on me, that was a place I wanted to be. And so I went to the Southern California Culinary Historians of Southern California Association to ask them, do you have any books in Central American, Mesoamerican history, anything that gives me more than El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America, and there was a 12-year civil war that caused many migrants to head north. I wanted more than that because I saw in my home we were so much more than that. And I thought, here's where I'm going to get all these answers. And the culinary historians, looked through their archives at Grand Central Library here in Los Angeles, and they came up empty. And the librarian actually said to me, it looks like if you want a book about Salvadoran food, you're going to have to write it yourself. And that was more than 8 years ago or something like that. And at the time, I had already started this project with my grandmother, my Mama Lucy, who is very important to me. And as the eldest of my elders, she gave me the blessing to start this project. So when I stumble on these librarians who I already have the utmost admiration and respect for, and they, hit me with this line, it was very much like, this is the point of no return. We are writing this book. And so, yeah, I've always felt like I'm trying to figure out my place here in LA. I'm very grateful for this city because it is a home for Salvadorans. And so I can see myself here. I think you know what that means when you say it, right? You can see yourself in a new place. But I very much wanted to hold on to these foodways. The way my family spoke about our cuisine, it wasn't something you just chewed. It was so much more than that. It grows in the ground, and so that's where your root is as well. And so it felt super important. I felt I had a somewhat of a duty, maybe. Maybe that's my eldest daughter syndrome showing. But yeah, I did feel somewhat of a duty to write stuff down and not let it just get lost into an abyss. So that is one moment of how this all started.
Wow, what a charge, it was like you go write it. And it looks like you took up that challenge, and the rest, as you say, is history. Um I feel like there's so much we're going to unpack between these incredible stories between Janet and Carla's. But we're going to take a slight detour into Jonathan's story, because obviously you're not building a business, right? You are the one supporting people like Janet and Carla. So can you tell us a little bit about how, you wound up doing this work and why it means so much to you?
Absolutely. And really why I love doing what I'm doing is because of people like Carla and Janet and their stories. I love helping people. And this is I'm risk adverse. That's why I became an attorney. So, but I do have a precocious 6-year-old who loves pickles and wants to start his own pickle company called Q's. But I got into intellectual property kind of in a roundabout way because I thought I wanted to be in entertainment. And then I worked on a movie and I realized that's just not what I want to do. And then I wanted to be an entertainment attorney, and I realized what they do is just contracts and it's kind of boring. And then I was lucky enough to get an internship at Coca-Cola when I was at law school at Emory in Atlanta. And I was working on a project clearing a trademark for an advertisement for Coca-Cola. And 3 weeks later, I was in the supermarket and saw the ad. And I realized that this is how mass communication, how we communicate to each other is through brands and brand stories, and the ability for a brand to convey a personal story like Carla's and Janet's is so important. And it really completely changed what I thought I wanted to do with my life. And I've been practicing in trademarks and IP for 24 years now. And happy to help small entrepreneurs, companies navigate this tricky process.
And tricky is no understatement at all, for anyone who's waded into this space. So I think the next question I want to ask, because Janet and Carla, you talk about um belonging and sense of identity. That's really something that anyone who is a person understands how important that is, to sort of have a strong sense of identity, who you are, where you come from, and then being rooted and feeling like you belong somewhere. um, those are things that are kind of abstract, but everyone can understand it. Now when you take that a step further and you put it into a product, or you put it into a book, what was your understanding of how much of that you could own, right? Like when you go about saying, I'm going to start a pickle business and I'm going to put this recipe together and I'm going to sell it at a farmer's market, or I'm going to put together all this historical data about Salvadorian people and the way that we prepare food and put it into a book. When you start that process, how do you, how do you wrap your head around what ownership means? How about we start with Paula? Oh, go ahead, Janet. Go ahead, Janet.
I'll share. Well, I think I'm glad that you brought that up because it's been a really big theme, just in this whole process of building recipes and really staying authentic to my culture's heritage and food and all of that, right? Because pickling and making kimchi has been around for thousands of years. Um, and I feel like just now it's becoming, more popular and people are enjoying the flavors of the kimchi, rather than kind of steering away from it how it used to be. But I think a large part is for me, it's allowed me to develop like a deeper relationship with my parents as well. Just getting tips and tricks from my mom, and I think that growing up as a Korean American, it's been challenging because I do see even in Koreatown in Los Angeles that there's a lot of restaurants that are altering their recipes to accommodate the American palate.
Mm.
And I think that I understand why that's happening, but also what it causes people to misinform others, of like the authenticity of our food. So they have a completely different experience of our food. So I think for me, it's been really important to, just maintain authentic to my own palate that I've had growing up, and not being afraid to introduce people to an unfamiliar flavor. When I come out with new products that people can't get even at the Korean market because they don't it's not a common side dish. uh, People are actually surprisingly very open to trying these foods. So it's been great to get that feedback. And that just reminds me to stay authentic, to really honor what's been passed down for generations, and to not be afraid to share those flavors and recipes.
I think that's beautiful. And I think there's a lot of different communities within the US that can relate to what you're describing about how the shift towards a more American palate changes the understanding of what that food is. You see it with Tex-Mex, right? The Mexican version of food in the United States, or Chinese food, which is a particular form that we have in the US, but is probably not what they're selling in China. And so you're spot on that there is sort of like a changing of the cuisine that happens here because of the local market. And what's really cool about what you're doing, and that is probably reflected in your brand, is that when people come to you, they know that In a Pickle is your authentic representation of your culture. And so if they want that authentic representation, they buy In a Pickle product versus another product, which is so great because it sort of lends itself more to your brand and the story that you're telling. And you can tell all of that without having to have a conversation with someone. Literally, all they have to do is taste your product, which is so cool. Carla, I'd love to bring you in to this conversation at this point to hear, your thoughts on all of this and the ownership and identity and how all that comes together.
I mean, I think this is one of the more provocative questions that, like, I love playing around with this thought, and my brain just kind of throws it up and down thinking through it. Because I think for me, what has been true is that a recipe is really an address. And when I was doing this work of interviewing people, excuse me, phone call came in. When I was interviewing the women for this cookbook, they would share certain ingredients that they would tell me, oh, but there's no access to that ingredient here. And it just put me back in El Salvador. It's an address. Cuisine is first and foremost regional. You eat what's around you. And so that authenticity that Janet is talking about is so integral to this story of ownership. Also, the other side of my brain is also thinking part of what makes having been in food media, my cuisine is always this other thing. It's not Italian, it's not French, it's not taken seriously as a fine dining concept. It's just this other thing that we're okay paying the minimal price because we see it as street food, right? And so the way to combat that is to let people see how I want you to take part in this, meaning I want you to bite into this and feel like you have a part in it, that you have some ownership in it. And that's how you see recipes kind of being molded into different things, because cuisine and culture should feel alive. Otherwise, it stays behind, and that's the thing I've been combating with documenting cuisine is I don't want it to be this relic of the past that we bring out, shake the dust off for the holidays, for Christmas. Like that to me feels silly when that's not how I was raised. This is something that's active. It it is real. I can really bite into it. And so for my work, I really tried to focus on what I could control. Um, Cuisine belongs to the people who are of that culture. In some ways, it's collective intellectual property. Not all of, I don't know all of Salvadoran cuisine, and that makes me excited. The good news is that there is more to learn. And so when I tried to do this book, I was so overwhelmed by people saying, oh, it's the first Salvi cookbook. It should have everything. It's like, okay, let me try my best and see what I come up with, right? Um, and so I really tried to focus on I am one person on this journey, and the people who have collaborated with me for this research, they also have had a very specific point of view. And so let's just write what you know, and that is always going to be good advice, good consejo, as we say. But I really feel that the realness of the book that I got to write was because I was so honest, and I was honest about what I didn't know about of the cuisine. And instead of that being a bad thing, it was an asset because it meant that we've been told lies and myths that our cuisine isn't worth anything. But guess what? There's more to know. And I was 14,000 words over my manuscript total. And so it means that there's a lot to learn. And yes, I think there's a lot of nuance, and it's big brain candy there as far as like food history. Um, but essentially, I think sticking to what I know, and this is how I have eaten these foods, prepared them in my kitchen, allowed me to not fret about what others might have said or opinions that might be cast on this project.
I love what you have to say about, being able to interject your voice into like the narrative of food history. I think that that's really beautiful because if you think about the cultures that have been heavily studied, it's not like one story is the reason why we know anything about that community. It's many voices. And what's great about what you've done is by doing this one, you might have encouraged other people to lend their voices. And that gives us, that perspective, that, holistic view of what it means to be Salvadorian, what it means to eat Salvadorian food. And then the other thing that you said that was really interesting is that, food isn't meant to be stagnant. It's not something that you dust off and you say, oh, this recipe is from 100 years ago. We're going to make it the way that we made it 100 years ago. Because as we know, like, even the world changes, right? The temperature changes. Some crops are available during some seasons, they're not during other seasons. And so it's just human nature to adjust. And you adjust because like this particular ingredient is used for this reason. And so let's find something else that we can use to match that reason. And the last thing that I thought was really cool about that was you can only see culture evolve if people are taking the time to actually like document where culture is now. And I think that's one thing that bridges the comments that both Carla and Janet have made about we are seeing a documentation of South Korean culture like significantly all over the internet, and people are really resonating with it from people in South Korea, even here. And now with the work that you're doing, Carla, over time, we'll be able to see how that culture evolves, which is really cool. And we can kind of see the authentic pieces and sort of like the adjustments and like the different directions it goes because people are willing to document and sort of own their piece or their voice in sort of like this whole conversation. So the way I'm going to pivot to Jonathan, which I don't know if he's ready for this, is a really provocative thing that Carla just said. And I don't know if you caught that about collective IP. And I want to bring in one that, food it can be a tricky space for intellectual property, just in terms of, IP and the kinds of IP that we have in the US, because we know that IP is not the same in every country, even though there's general agreement. But that piece about collective IP has actually been an issue, even like at the world IP level, in terms of who owns and if people can own collectively. So I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts in terms of how do people come to you, Jonathan, with their IP concerns, and do you have any thoughts in terms of this concept of collective IP and what it means for especially ethnic food entrepreneurs who are looking to preserve something that they feel they are shepherding and don't necessarily own by themselves?
Yeah, I mean, first, I just want to say personally, I think that how lucky are we that we live in a time when American consumers are open to trying so many new foods, and really, I love the incorporation of, and we'll talk about whether the tension there of incorporation of some of the of non-American foods into American foods and what that means to preserving those cultures. Just real quick, Carla, on the book concept, I think to get a trademark registered for a book, you have to have a series. So it's great that you were 14,000 words over, and you probably have volume 2, because when you do, then you can register the name of your cookbook as a trademark. But going back, and also just the fact that we're using, you know, food to move cultural forward, I think is amazing. But with the collective IP, I think there's the tension there is it being co-opted by bigger companies, and maybe that's not the greatest way of things are going. I mean, I think to me it's amazing when you look at restaurants, ketchup used to be the condiment of choice, and now Sriracha's everywhere, right? But there is this aspect of cultural, I'll say cultural appropriation by companies of taking food products and then making them Americanized and leaving the cultural behind, or not addressing the significance of that dish or that sauce or that condiment with that culture. And I think there's the tension there is, well, where is the line on what you can do and what's free competition and what is culturally right or morally right as a brand? And I think that's part of the issue with the role of intellectual property. And, you know, copyrights and patents are in the Constitution, and they're there to provide some protection to incentivize invention. And trademarks are not mentioned in the Constitution, but they're there to protect consumers. And I think there's got to be a balance there where you can have some protection for intellectual property for an innovation, but balance with the fact that you can't use that intellectual property to stifle competition. And I think where we get concerned is or issues like with the Momofuku and the chili crisp, right? That somebody's trying to take out from the culture a name of a generic name or a descriptive name of a sauce or a condiment and claim it as their own. And we've seen that, you know, there's a fight. I mean, not that Taco Tuesday is culturally appropriate, but there are fights over that, or whether somebody can own the term Taco Tuesday, right? So I think there are limits to what intellectual property can protect, and I think those are there to protect cultures and historically relevant dishes and condiments and food products. And we just have to walk that line and make sure that people aren't using intellectual property as a barrier for getting these products, these important cultural products, out to the market.
Yeah, I think those are really great points. And, you know, the interesting thing about trademarks in particular is that's probably it's an example of like a two-way conversation. It's like the brand telling consumers, this is, you know, my product, and consumers saying, yes, I want this product because it's from you. So it's like, I want this sweatshirt because it's nice, but I want it more because it has Nike, you know, swoosh on it, right? And so it's very interesting the way trademark can be leveraged by the brand, but it's also interesting in the way that it can be a way for consumers to talk back to brands and say, you know what, because of your business practices, I don't want to buy your product, or because you're not authentic, I don't want to buy your product, or because you are authentic, we want to buy your product. So I think David Chang's example is a great one, because yes, it was the, you know, larger business community that was saying you're stifling, you know, the food entrepreneurship space, but it was also consumers who were like, we're going to boycott this. Like, this isn't right. And it was a great way to show that conscious consumerism is also a part of IP awareness and IP sort of protection, because at the end of the day, that's where it can be really powerful for those who are not even IP holders. It's a great way for consumers to speak back to businesses and say, we like this or we don't like this, and we're going to buy it or we're not going to buy it. An example that I saw in my home country was when Heinz, the tomato company, made a jollof sauce and for West Africa, jollof rice is like our primary grain. And so to see Heinz bring out the sauce that's supposed to be used to make this dish was really upsetting because it didn't taste anything like it. There were no indigens like leverage to develop the recipe. It just seemed like, to Jonathan's point, a sort of corporate grab for something that, the culture really relies on. And I think that that is something that I wonder from, both Janet and Carla, what are your thoughts about, where this space, this industry is going, right? Because once upon a time, it was all these corporate giants that were bringing out food products. But with more and more immigrant populations coming into the US and maybe not being able to find some products, the the packaging of ethnic foods seems to be on the rise. With every new ethnic group that either becomes really popular or a particular dish becomes popular, you start to see like a packaged ingredient or almost finished product come to the stores. But I don't know how many people are kind of aware of what that process looks like. And Janet, for you, someone who's actually in the product development process, you have pickles, right? That people will buy and they'll enjoy. They're not at home making the mix themselves unless they're part of your workshop. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that process and what it means to be part of the team or the group that is sort of like developing these things, and how that affects sort of our understanding of culture.
Yeah, I think that it's been interesting to see like everyone has a voice now with social media and there's such a connection there and as far as when I go out to the farmers markets and we're connecting directly with our consumers, um, that we've been able to get instant feedback from our customers, which has been actually quite amazing because we'll put out a product and we get instant feedback from them on what they think about it and their experience of it. um, yeah, I think that just in terms of like getting our product out and experimenting with different types of packaging, it's it could kind of be a double-edged sword sometimes because because everyone has a voice, you'll it's like you have to kind of accommodate other people's opinions on your packaging, using plastic, for example, or having sustainable packaging. But at the same time, it could also be quite helpful because you're hearing all this feedback from your consumers and you're able to kind of cater to them in a way, but also like it's a whole learning process. You learn what works and what doesn't, and the only way to do that is through experimentation. And that's kind of how I do my recipes as well. It's all experimentation, and it's a learning process, and I just figure out what works, what gets good feedback and what gets negative feedback, and then adjusting from there. So same way as I go about, packaging and branding, and a lot of different other ways that I go about the business. Oh, I think you're muted. Yeah, there we go.
I was just saying that that totally makes perfect sense. And I can really sort of empathize with the double-edged sword because at the stage that you're at, you're right. You're face to face with your customers. So if you're at a farmer's market and someone comes every Saturday or every Sunday and they're a regular customer, the ability to sort of adjust and tweak is a benefit. But then it's also kind of like, okay, I've adjusted and tweaked. Like that's a lot already. And there are probably business costs and consequences to each tweak. But then the question is, if you move from the farmer's market to maybe like the Target store shelf, how does that shift? adjust and evolve the way that you are sort of nurturing that brand, because then it becomes something kind of fixed in time, and people are always coming to that. So I don't know if that's something that you've explored, sort of going into big box stores, what that kind of transition might mean for some of the decisions you've made about in a pickle.
Yeah, definitely. I've explored that aspect and just figuring out what the next step is for expansion. Um, and another challenge that I've come across is that, um, I started off as a pickle company, and then I kind of branched off into making different kimchi products. But um, kimchi is its in a way it's its own category, but it's under the umbrella of a pickle, right? Um, the way I see pickles, like pickles are like the Korean kimchi, and kimchi is kind of the American pickle, right? So it all kind of meshes together, but I've been very careful to not market myself as a kimchi company.
Mm.
Um, I'm and that's a big part of branding and the message that you're sending. But as far as branding and packaging, when I do go that direction into the big box stores, I think it's going to be even more important to you know send out the message that like we are a gourmet pickle business making kimchi products. And then also I think the message can sometimes, unfortunately, you have less control of the aesthetic and the message that you're sending out when you do go the corporate direction, just because you know you're under the control of what they're requesting of you. So I think, yeah, that's something that I'm gonna have to definitely wrap my head around and adjust my branding.
That makes perfect sense. So Carla, I know that you are a food developer, and you develop recipes, but Savvy Soul, the cookbook, is sort of like the thing that you're offering to the world for right now. Um, do you mind sharing? We talked about this initially in some of our earlier conversations about what the challenge has been, having done all this work and put all this effort into this cookbook, and now having introduced it into the world, and sort of like the obstacle that maybe you weren't expecting, that you've now sort of found yourself in, and what it means for other people who are trying to sort of share their own voice and add their sort of story to the food history lexicon.
Yes. So I started this project, which here's the book for anyone who hasn't seen it. It's my baby. Um, I started this project. I originally wanted it to be a zine, because publishing, I was told, no one is interested in publishing a Salvadoran cookbook. It hasn't been done. People are not interested. When I, would pitch agents, they would say, "Where in Mexico is El Salvador?" Like just all kinds of no's everywhere. And so I thought, well, maybe I could self-publish. But to self-publish was at least $10,000 that I didn't have. And so my options were really, well, I'm gonna make an Instagram account, and I know there's people I'm not, my story is not so original that I'm the only person who wants to, cook food from home, from the homeland. And so I knew I wanted a name that was a quick name that people could kind of understand uh my whole impulse and intention behind it. And it took me a while, and it was actually right after a Zumba class that it came to me. I was like, exercise will do that. there's nothing exercise, like no lapse in ideas when you've moved your body. And so it came to me, I was like, Salvi Sol. That's the name of this, Salvi Sol. And I knew I had wanted a word that was made up because I had heard from the minimal research I had done like 9 years ago that words that were made up, you could protect yourself a bit more, or, not suffer as much grief for intellectual property things. And I thought, well, okay, Salvi Sol, it is. Salvi is a cute word that a lot of Salvadoran diaspora folks refer to. It does have a few other contexts in Norway and Italy, but for the most part, Salvadorans have kind of taken over, which that could be a whole nother conversation. And so I talked to my accountant, and we put a few trademarks on the word and kind of forgot about it. I was like, okay, I've done my due diligence. We can continue figuring this whole project out. And, a few years later, I see that there's someone who's using the exact spelling of it, Salvisol, um, and they're a pupusa restaurant on a food truck. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, I mean, again, you do have personal things that come to you that are unique to you, but salvi and soul, like it's not, someone else is bound to put those two words together. Um, and I called my person who helped me put everything together, and they explained, well, Carla, do you want to go into the restaurant business? I said, absolutely not. This is not my calling. I love writing. This is an office I've made out of a closet. I love it here. I research this who I am. And so he's like, well, you can't when you own a trademark, you are filing it for a specific category. And that's the part I hadn't realized. And he's like, so unless, and then there's a whole process of proof that you've been operating in that way. Um, unless that's just how it is. I was like, oh, okay, well, this is turning out to be more of an education than I thought was a defense plan. And then another person actually uh uses the name, and they're a Salvadoran jazz musician, which is kind of a groovy name for a jazz musician. I'll give it to them. But yeah, not at all where I am skilled in life. And so those were kind of some things that I realized, okay, there's more to it than this. And then the most recent one is that there are two copycats who are using the name The Sawiso Cookbook, and it's completely AI books on Amazon. And, you know, when I was thinking about self-publishing, one of the main reasons why I thought don't do it is because I knew, like, I have to be the marketing, the legal, the everything for self-publishing. Those are so many skill sets that there's entire professions behind. Like I can't do that. And so when this thing happened, I immediately contacted my publisher, which is the big five publishers, Penguin Random House. I explained to them, these are the two copycats. Here's the links. I'm totally going to put this on main and tell people so they know that there's a fake, account out there, or a fake version of this. And all I really got was, here's a form that you can fill out. You put your link here, and if if the legal team can prove that there's verbatim of the cookbook, then they might be able to do something about it. If not, then it's just a disrespect. I think their words were unfortunate and disrespectful thing that is happening. I was so floored by this. I couldn't believe that this was like their what's the word? Their reaction to this. And I think that this is where One thing I feel like is so important when looking at this, and it helped me kind of frame my own um, thoughts about it and how I'm gonna last, right? Putting out work and not being afraid that it's gonna get copycatted, is that the history of copyrights and intellectual property is also rooted in colonialism. You look
Mm,
at the history of things that have the protections, and it's often POC intellect that has been protected by white people who said, I know how to protect it and you don't. If you look at the history of perfume, of the recipes, all of these ingredients come from Africa, come from Asia. And so for me, it's important to frame and root the conversation in those historical facts because it tells me historically the things that my people know isn't going to be protected. So
mm,
I can show up and say, community, there's these two copycats.
yeah.
Do with that information, what you will. And, there are people who I let them know how you can help me because this is a big problem, is you can write a comment for my book. I was very clear, don't bother going over there because algorithms will also bite you, in the ass. Because now if you go to write a comment on theirs, their book comes up because it's getting all this traffic. Even if it's rage traffic, it's getting the traffic. And so those are things that I let people know. And we got a great boost of people writing comments and people leaving reviews, which is so, so important. Um, and so yeah, like I think my philosophy and honestly the grit that, and it's not just because of me being an immigrant and being a woman of color in publishing, when this is the first of its kind. It's even if I lose, I win. Even if I lose, I win. And I'm going to try to get as many resources as I can. But it's never over, and there's always something else. And those books are still on Amazon. But I checked because I was being petty. I wanted to see what comments were left or reviews. And there were tons of people who left earnest and sincere um, reviews saying like, please support an author who has almost done 10 years of research. And that's the book that's right is the Salviso Cookbook by Carla Tatiana Vasquez. And so yeah, I think that there's so many thoughts, but that is what I can say coherently right now.
Um, so one, we have 5 minutes left, and I had a feeling this would happen. Like, when I spoke to all of you, I knew this was going to happen because there's just so much richness in this discussion. So I'm going to keep my comments really short and ask Jonathan the last question. And after that question, we will go to a quick poll so that maybe there's enough time to run through my closing remarks. One, I think that AI and IP is definitely something that is at the top of everyone's minds, especially for anyone who is in the copyright space. It's coming up more in patents, but I think copyright is the one that is really like rattling people's brains because it's like, how do we protect assets that are published, right, from being basically scrambled and put back on the market for someone who hasn't done the 10 years of work. The other comment that I do want to lift up that is a whole nother discussion is IP, and the framework under which it developed. And the colonial sort of the global north impact on IP, because I do think that it's undeniable. And if you look at the global treaties and things like that sort of control IP, it is predominantly the global north, and the global south usually doesn't have as robust IP frameworks and is usually several years behind for a variety of reasons. And this is sort of where I'm going to kick it back to Jonathan, because I know that DEI is something that is near and dear to your heart and is part of the reason that you're part of California IP Alliance. You know, there's the effort to sort of diversify the IP ecosystem for a lot of these reasons, because it's not just the copyrights that are being, you know, created, but it's also the patents, the ideas that people have that, you know, people may not understand because they're not culturally adjacent or part of that culture, and so sometimes those ideas get dismissed. Those are stories that I have heard. I don't know if those are stories that you've heard, but you know, what do you think the future of this ecosystem holds if it doesn't diversify? And what do we stand to lose if we don't, you know, make sure that everyone is able to participate in this ecosystem the way that they should?
Yeah, and I think that the diversity and the equity and the inclusion is important. And what Carla's talking about, and my heart breaks, but you do have a great position about it. Like putting your work out there is what you want to do, and you're not going to get sidetracked trying to fight off these AI infringers. But that it's access to the legal market, right? Or to you can have all the intellectual property you want, but there's a cost in the United States to enforcing that, and it can cost a lot of money. And hopefully through, I think what maybe your publisher is trying to do is hopefully try to do a quick takedown on Amazon and get it removed. But that is really what we're talking about, is access to yes, we have intellectual property. Yes, they can help in some of these issues. Recipes are really tough because they can't be protected by copyright. They can be protected by patent, but it has to be something new. It can't be a 1,000-year-old recipe. But if you have a new way of doing something, a new way of getting the pickling process down shorter, or making it more effective, or being able to scale up so you can go to a big box, that's an invention that you can protect through a patent. And I think that's, you know, getting these stories out there and getting the basic consumer to understand intellectual property rights and what can be protected, and also using social media and the ability to kind of, yes, it's expensive to sue somebody, but maybe through social media, you can find the terrible term, but the terrible twist of the term is social justice. But like, you can use social media to kind of advance things that you couldn't maybe financially do in court. And it's really the fact that we now have a shared voice and being able to jump up and down and say, hey, this is not right. And maybe that's not intellectual property lawsuit that I tend to deal with, but that's really how the market works right now. And I think it's good. We're lucky we live in that time, and it's hopefully going to get better. But the IP challenges that we're going to face and getting these stories out there is not going to go away, and it's going to continue to get harder and harder.
So thank you for your comments, Jonathan. And I'm glad that this popped up. The poll has been shared because, as I mentioned, we are definitely running out of time. But, you know, we hope that you have found today's discussion insightful and inspiring. I know that I personally have. Protect Your Story, honestly, is an homage to small business owners. We believe that someone who creates something should be able to control it. Although if you aren't aware that what you create has value, how can you? How do you control it? How do you protect it? That's why we felt like this program is important. By meeting small business owners where they are, they can take their intellectual property seriously and take it out of the technical and theoretical and put it squarely where creators can understand it and connect with it. So as we mentioned earlier, this webinar kicks off our Protect Your Story webinar series more broadly. And we hope to continue sharing stories of entrepreneurs in various creative industries. We hope that you will see yourselves in these stories and feel empowered. Please remember that the world is a much better place because you decided to share your story through your art, your innovation, and your creativity. And the Michelson Intellectual Property Institute is here to ensure that you protect that act of bravery and that other people respect it. The very next stop on this sort of webinar series journey is going to be about fashion and IP. And if you're interested in that, we'll be sharing the link for that registration through our newsletter. And so if that's of interest to you, we hope that you'll join the newsletter. As a thank you for joining this first webinar, you will be receiving an exclusive sneak peek into a new resource. We've prepared a guide that has some case studies that bring more examples examples of IP in the food entrepreneurship space to life. You'll be able to access the studies through the email that we're going to send out. And then the recording of today's discussion will be posted on our YouTube page, shared via email and accessible via our resource hub. And you can find the resource hub on the michelsonip.com website, which has been dropped in the link. And you can also go to that link to learn more about our work in the intellectual property space. Additionally, if you or your organization wants to become a part of our work, focused on supporting the democratization of IP education and diversifying the IP ecosystem and the innovation ecosystem, please reach out to me personally at chinwe@20mm.org. And you can also stay engaged by signing up for our newsletter, which we mentioned previously, which can be found at our website, michelsonip.com. That's where you'll receive the news and updates about our programs, as well as all of our other events. So I want to say thank you to our incredible panelists for this really riveting and inspiring discussion. This has been beyond my wildest dreams. I'm so grateful to the three of you. And thank you to our audience for sticking around for 3 extra minutes and sticking out for the whole conversation. I hope that this really was enriching for you all. So thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.